The White House and Republican lawmakers are inching closer and closer to closing a deal that would raise the national debt limit for 2 years while imposing caps on discretionary spending not related to military or veterans. Also doing so for 2 years, according to the New York Times. The deal would allow the GOP to say they were reducing some federal spending and also allow Democrats to say they saved most domestic programs from major cuts.
The deal, if agreed upon and enacted, would raise the government's borrowing limit for 2 years past the 2024 presidential election. And in exchange for raising the debt limit, Republicans' demand to cut some federal spending would be met, the Times reports. Washington Post reporter Jeff Stein tweeted yesterday, "If the deal holds, big if, we are looking at essentially flat funding for domestic programs like anti-poverty, rental aid, transit, science, etc. I had been expecting a major cut based on everything in the prior few days."
Yeah, what a mess. What an absolute mess. I see this as Democrats being entirely weak.
I feel the same about Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, it's absurd. The whole notion of like using the debt limit as a bargaining chip to say, all right, I don't like what the prior Congress budgeted, so I'm going to say, guess what? We add no more new dollars to the economy, which is unnecessary. We've raised the debt limit 78 separate times since 1960. Most governments don't have a debt limit. They issue debt as needed to fund their public spending, and they don't think twice about it. The fact that we have this at all is simply, it was an accounting necessity a few years ago, like over half a century ago. It was just like, all right, how can we consolidate all of our public spending into one account and keep a record of it? Now they're like, hey, we're going to make legislation about this so that we actually have to vote for it to be raised in order to have new spending. And it's like getting a credit card bill and saying, I don't like what I've spent money on, so I'm going to renegotiate where this spending is going. It's absurd.
I feel like my frustration with the Republican Party is whenever they actually have real power, they don't enact these spending cuts that they claim are a central part of their party platform. They kick the football down the road, or that's not the right analogy, kick the can down the road and save it for this sort of show-offy, last-minute, holdout kind of deal-making scenario. And it's like, okay, well, you know, the first few years of the Trump administration, the first 2 years, y'all had control of Congress. You could have, in addition to the tax cuts, also tried to cut spending so that we didn't end up with this massive deficit under Trump. And instead, they just waited until this last-minute moment where obviously they weren't going to get anything substantial out of it anyway because Biden was so resistant to the idea of tying the debt limit to any cuts whatsoever. So it just feels to me like they always do this sort of last minute bargaining chip kind of nonsense, and it's hard to take it seriously.
That's interesting. Yeah, they're like, we're doing it because we have to, because the debt's too high. We have to make these cuts. I think the reason Trump didn't do it under his administration is very straightforward, and it's because cutting Social Security, not very popular. Cutting benefits, not very popular. Shutting down the government and saying we have to shut it down because we can't raise the debt limit. We have too much debt. We've been irresponsible financially as a nation. Oh my God. Now we have no choice. Our hand is forced in making these cuts. It's a little bit easier to tell people that that's the narrative. But it's not so easy when you say, we're not going to touch the $858 billion that we give to the military, but, you know, we might not be able to make good on Treasury bonds. We might not be able to make good on Social Security checks. So we're going to starve grandpa and grandma, but, you know, we're going to keep the nukes. We're going to keep our military spending. Like, that's absurd. That hypocrisy, I think, makes it very clear that this is about a political agenda of austerity, of cutting social programs, which I think your point is right. If they want to do it and Republicans want to cut public spending, they should do it in a regular legislative session and say, this is what we stand for. This is what we want as a party. And I think the reason they don't is because it's unpopular.
Right. And there's a way to package it too, and a way to have reformed spending that maybe leads to cuts that doesn't leave people out in the cold, right? Like, there's way to reform these programs in ways that they're more efficient, which saves money without actually reducing the level of care and aid that people are getting from the social safety net. And there's also tons of waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government just by matter of it being a massive bureaucracy. I mean, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars on bizarre research programs involving like puppies getting AIDS and just really weird stuff. We learned a lot of it from the releases from the NIH when people were investigating COVID, some of the weird medical experiments that they were doing. And yeah, these are small potatoes, hundreds of millions of dollars when you compare it to the trillions of dollars that we actually spend in the federal budget. But I feel like it would be much more politically popular and feasible if Republicans were focusing on these areas of common agreement for where to save money, as opposed to giving this perception that they're going to reduce people's Social Security checks, which obviously most people reasonably are not in support of.
So you support cuts in spending? Like, you think we should reduce the national debt?
I'd like to, but it's not, for me, reducing spending is not like the means to an end. Like, I don't think it's an intrinsic good.
Okay.
I would prefer it because I like to save taxpayers' money, and it is kind of outrageous to me how much we waste. But I also am in favor of certain social programs, especially pro-family programs. I'm a huge fan of Marco Rubio's proposals to increase child tax credits, to increase paid family leave, to give stipends to new mothers, for example. So I think our understanding of why we spend money from the federal government kind of needs to change and prioritize taking care of people, encouraging people to have families, encouraging people to buy homes, all of these things that we think of when we envision the American dream.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about what our spending priorities should be. I like the analogy. I don't know, you can't really call it an analogy. It's just descriptive that a budget is a testament to your morals. What do you value? And when we look at the economy, there are so many gaps where the market is not addressing needs, things that we all value. It's important to understand the difference of things we value, things we get utility from, things we like spending on that are our priorities, not dollar value, right? It's not very profitable to take care of people who are sick and have sick care or elderly care. There's a huge gap in the market where there are a lot of people who are older who are not getting the care that they need, and their kids are busy working by necessity and they can't care for their parents in the same way we see in other countries. That's a problem. That's not something the market's going to address. That's something where the government should be stepping in and saying, okay, it's worthwhile to spend public dollars on something like this. It's actually good for the economy to spend public dollars on investing in sustainable infrastructure, rebuilding our roads, high-speed rails, investing in education so that we have a trained workforce, not just education in the form of higher education and universities, but trade schools as well. So when they talk about more public spending as if it's always a bad thing, what is the government for, if not to organize the deliverance of public goods? That's like why we have a government in the first place, is because we said, well, like if Amber and I decide we want our kids to have a school and we both decide, all right, let's hire someone as a teacher and pay them, that would not be as quality of an education as if we got everybody in the block together and we said, let's pool our resources and make schools. That's how the first schools came to be. And then, of course, we decided, let's get more serious about this. Let's have this be a part of our official government. Let's have the government provide public education. We call it public schools, and we all pool our resources together in the form of taxes. We've gotten to the point where we have to convince elected officials what the government is for, that the government should achieve its intended purpose. And that is so backwards, and that's really underneath the entire debt ceiling debate, is what are public dollars for?
Yeah, and I'm definitely not in the camp of anytime we increase spending for a certain program that is intrinsically bad, right? It depends on what it's for. And what frustrates me is we end up, the way that we do these spending packages, like if we could separate out every piece of federal legislation as it relates to spending and vote on those on a line item basis, there would be so much less boondoggle nonsense. I mean, right now we pass these spending packages like the infrastructure bill contains all of these kickbacks to certain congresspeople and senators for their districts that has nothing to do with infrastructure whatsoever. Just because of the way that the process is working nowadays and the way that they've sort of created this snowball effect where things that are totally unrelated to each other get jammed into one piece of massive, like 3,000-page legislation. It's like people don't even know what they're voting for anymore. And I feel like we would have much more efficient, effective social programs if we took them on a line item basis and actually understood where those dollars were going.
Yeah, And that's what we're at the risk of right now, with Janet Yellen saying things like, well, we're going to have to make some priorities about which things don't get funded. We'll maybe prioritize Social Security over making good on the Treasury bonds or what have you. That's not under the purview of the executive branch of the United States. The president has tried in the past to item by item approve things in the budget. And the Supreme Court said, no. This is up to Congress. You don't actually have the power to do this. And so Yellen, by saying we're going to make some budgetary priorities, that's unconstitutional. If this goes back to the Supreme Court, I hope to God the Supreme Court does not say, actually, yeah, you guys can decide, which things you're going to prioritize. The 14th Amendment says that there is a duty by the executive to handle the public debts, that public debts are legitimate. They can raise the debt limit through the power of the 14th Amendment and go to the Treasury and the Fed and say, actually, you do have to issue these bonds to fund this spending. They could do that, but what they can't do is decide what to spend on and what to default on. The idea that we have to default by necessity is also like such a big misconception that I hear right now. People are on like TikTok and social media platforms right now saying the government's running out of money, the Treasury is running out of dollars. That's not what's happening. They're defaulting because they want to default. The U.S. government will never run out of its own currency. Alan Greenspan, the former chair of the Federal Reserve, has said this. Warren Buffett has said this. And Fitch right now
and Trump,
is saying,
I think, right?
Trump has said this as well. And Fitch is saying we're going to downgrade the U.S. government's credit rating because they're defaulting by choice. The U.S. government will never run out of dollars. They can press a button and credit an account. They should have a AAA plus credit rating. They're defaulting by necessity as a political tool at the expense of working people.
Well, I, for one, am shocked that TikTok would ever have political
misinformation.
Yeah, that's really stunning to me. We'll be back with more Rising right after this.